Breaking the Wall of War. How human security makes people safe in a global era. Mary Kaldor, London School of Economics.
When the wall came down, we were glued to the television. I remember my 10-year-old son saying, "Can't we have history here too?"
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a huge privilege to be here, and it's rather terrifying to be the first to speak. You may be rather surprised, since my subject is war, to see a picture of a nice pub in the south of England. The reason it's there is that I took part recently in an army exercise called Urban Warrior that took place in Southampton. According to the scenario for this exercise, Southampton was the capital of a country called the Southwest Protectorate. It was a poor country, southern part of Britain. It was predominantly Anglican, but it had a 15% Muslim minority. And Muslim forces from the country to the north had invaded Southampton. Southampton also had militant Muslim and Anglican groups, high unemployment and criminality, and the government of the Southwest Protectorate had requested NATO's aid. So we stood, it's gone a bit too quickly, we stood in a multi-story car park deciding how to take the flats opposite, which were occupied by the Muslim forces. I asked, well, wouldn't this cause a lot of civilian casualties? Would we really do this if Southampton had been invaded? They'd been invaded ostensibly to protect the Muslim minorities, but really because Southampton had oil. I said, wouldn't we instead try to restore order in Southampton, make it a nice place, and try to undermine them politically? Actually, most of the soldiers agreed, but they said, war fighting is our core business. We can't be an army without being able to war fight, and so we have to practice. And so that's my question that Helga was raising. Do we have to practice? Is war fighting going to bring us security? I think since the end of the Second World War, there's been a dramatic decline in what I call old wars, wars between states where battle is the decisive encounter and it's battle between regular armed forces. Instead, what we see is the spread of a new type of political and criminal violence that involves state and non-state actors, in which the main violence is directed against civilians and in which forced displacement, expelling people from their homes, is a very typical characteristic. These wars are often fought in the name of ethnic or religious identity, and they very often involve crime. They're usually financed by various forms of crime like loot and plunder at its simplest, or smuggling in drugs, oil, human beings. And in a sense, they're almost better described as a sort of predatory political economy in which, for political and economic reasons, the various parties have a vested interest in the war, in the conflict continuing. And that's why we see large areas of the world, Central Asia, Central America, the Horn of Africa, where this kind of political economy is spreading. I call them new wars to distinguish them from old wars. But actually, they're not necessarily new. They have many characteristics similar to the early modern period in Europe. They often were going on during the Cold War, but we didn't notice them because we were so preoccupied with the Cold War. There are some new features that have to do with globalization, that have to do with communication. But the key point is that using old war techniques, war fighting, in these situations makes things worse. That's what I think happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. outsiders used old war techniques in new war situations, and things simply got worse. So what would be a different approach? I think we need a different approach, and I'm like the idea of human security. What do I mean by human security? Human security is, first of all, about the security of individuals and the communities in which they live, rather than about the security of states and borders. It's secondly about security from different kinds of existential threats, not just violence, but related things like poverty, disease, natural disaster. And thirdly, and I think very importantly, it involves a blurring between the internal and the external. We're used to thinking that domestically, at least we who live in Europe, security is maintained through a rule of law. We have emergency services like firefighters, ambulance brigades, police, and that externally our security is guaranteed by military forces. I think we're looking at something like externally being more like what we're used to internally, that we're moving towards, or we should move towards, if we want to maintain security, an international rule of law based on individuals rather than states. I think we need something like global emergency services. Our external security capabilities would be a contribution to those external capabilities. They would involve both military and civilians, but the military would operate under civilian command, and they would operate according to quite different principles. Their goal would be protecting people rather than defeating enemies. Their goal would be dampening down violence rather than winning wars. And that's a huge cognitive difference. Many of these ideas are actually beginning to be adopted in things like national security strategies, in the European Union's external policy, even in the US counterinsurgency doctrine, that's why General Petraeus is there, which stressed population security. And these new ideas for soldiers on the ground and for others, humanitarian workers, came out of the actual experience of being involved in these types of wars in recent years. But actually, the new ideas have not translated into new capabilities. This contradiction was very evident in the recent intervention in Libya. The goal was wonderful. It was a real breakthrough. The goal was to protect civilians, but the means were traditional air power. And you can't protect civilians with traditional air power. Actually, the airstrikes were very precise, and we should all be very happy that Gaddafi was overthrown. But nevertheless, many people died in the conflict, and the tensions that resulted from the conflict are here to stay for a long time and will make democracy very difficult. Actually, at the moment, budgetary cuts mean that the kind of security capabilities we need are the first to be cut. Countries like the US, Britain, and France are protecting what they see as their core mission. And one of the outcomes of what's going wrong in Afghanistan has been actually an increasing reliance on long-distance air power. The drone campaign, for example, in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, which doesn't solve anything and actually contributes to growing insecurity. So, in a way, I think what we're facing is a very serious security crisis, and I think we can't de-link that from our economic crisis. It's not just that our traditional preoccupations with war have actually contributed to economic crisis. In very obvious ways, high military spending is linked to global imbalances. It's not by chance that the debt crisis occurred after two very expensive wars, just as the first breakdown in the post-war system in 1971 occurred after Vietnam. I think also military structures are so embedded in state structures that they really make it very difficult to change. But by the same token, it works the other way around. I think austerity dramatically increases people's insecurity, and that insecurity can translate into more dangerous developments. We can see these spreading areas of insecurity happening, and I just think it's terribly important at this point. We can see that they're contributing to increased migratory power pressure just at the moment when we are having our own problems. So I think it's terribly important if we want to be able to deal differently with the Southamptons of this world, that we do try to establish a basis which could actually rekindle trust in our institutions. We believe in our institutions if they keep us safe, and we're losing trust in our institutions because they don't keep us safe. And I think that's a precondition, actually, for economic recovery. So thank you very much.